I'm very happy to introduce Julie Matthews. Julie is a certified nutrition consultant specializing in autism spectrum disorders and is a co-founder of Nourishing Hope. She's the author of Nourishing Hope for Autism, an award-winning parent and clinician's guide to the fundamentals of autism nutrition, dietary implementation, and supplementation. She is also the creator of Cooking to Heal, an autism education and cooking class program that provides public education in cities across the country. Julie is a graduate of Bauman College and of the University of California, Davis, where she received a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and Managerial Economics. Please welcome Julie Matthews.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you so much for coming. It is very difficult to have the last slot of the whole conference. And I didn't know how many people would come, so I am thrilled that all of you decided to stay and make this a priority. So I'm going to be talking about nutrition and cooking today, and I do tend to speak kind of quickly, so you can have a copy of the slides, and we'll make sure you get everything that you need, and I will try to save some time for questions. I will save some time for questions. The nice thing about having the last slot of the day is that we have one of the longest time slots in the whole conference, which is an hour and a half, so I'm excited about that. All right. So as I mentioned, I'm a certified nutrition consultant, and I'm approaching autism from how you can help your children from that perspective, and I'm really excited to be able to do that. So, by the way, my sponsor is Houston Enzymes, and I'll talk somewhat about enzymes as well, but we're going to be talking about good food, good nutrition, how to make it work. All right, so today, if you go over to my booth and you sign up for our email newsletter list, we'll make sure that you get a copy of the slides. I have 5 articles that were published in the autism file that you'll also get, and I have a step-by-step guide to gluten-free and casein-free implementation. And we're going to be talking actually about a lot of the steps of that today. So you will get all of that for free as long as we have your email address. So outside of this door, straight across, you'll see our sign, and my husband will be there, so if you have to cut out a little bit early, you can go by and see him, and he can help you with that. Okay, so today we're going to talk about autism as a whole body disorder. We're going to talk about what nutrition today looks like and why it's creating so many challenges for our children, the foods and ingredients to avoid, and the good nutrient-dense foods to add. And we're going to talk some about special diets. So how many were in Dr. Hamilton's talk yesterday? Okay. Some of you, maybe half of you. So we'll make sure, I'm going to cover the special diets as well, and we're going to also talk about cooking and meal ideas and support for picky eaters. So we're going to talk about the picky eater piece a little bit more towards the end. So I would imagine most of you have picky eaters because the experience with my clients is that that's the vast majority. So when I'm talking about all these good nutrient-dense foods, know that I am going to get to your picky eaters and talk about how to integrate these really nutritious foods for all children and make them really kid-friendly. So keep that open mind that we're going to get to that part. Okay, so all of you know the symptoms of autism, so I don't need to go into those. But what I wanted to share is that most people aren't aware of the common physical symptoms that many of the children share. Now, it's different for every child, but it's often constipation, diarrhea, it might be lots of colds, lots of ear infections, hyperactivity, sleeping challenges, those types of things. And when we see that autism is not just a grouping of sort of mysterious behavioral and other types of kind of brain-related conditions, but it actually is a whole body condition, this is where the power is. Because when we see that this all works together, as you help work on the health of the body, you work on the health of the brain as well. And so that's really where I think the key to all of this is, and the reason that diet and nutrition support autism. So autism is a neurological condition where the body chemistry influences the brain chemistry. So Dr. Martha Herbert, and if you heard her speak on Friday, she's one of my favorites. I just think she's amazing. She coined the term autism as a whole body disorder and says that the brain is downstream. So, we often think of this brain as this kind of mysterious thing, and how do we get at the brain? Well, the brain is connected to the body and all the biochemistry. So this chart on the left is from my book, and it just goes into some of the complexity of what's going on in the body and what's going on with environmental factors influencing all of that. And when we see that the brain is connected to the body and all of this kind of chaos that's going on, we can see that very direct connections to the brain. So for example, if you have too many antibiotics, or you just get antibiotics, and it kills off your bad bacteria, it also kills off the good, and yeast can grow. Well, one of the things that yeast does is it creates very spacey, foggy thinking. And that is a direct effect on the brain. In fact, it can create kind of drunken-like behaviors. So we can see that that body condition affects the brain. When we look at inflammation that can happen, whether it's in the gut or because of the immune system dysregulation, we know that children with autism have more brain inflammation. So again, we have a direct connection. When the gut is not absorbing our nutrients, we don't have those nutrients available that we need for that brain to function. And if our gut is not working and we're not breaking down things like wheat and dairy, we actually can break those proteins into these long protein chains rather than individual amino acids. And those long protein chains actually fit in the opiate receptor and mimic opium, opiates, morphine. So you can imagine if you're on morphine, how do you feel? Foggy, spacey, inattentive. You might have trouble forming words. You might have an intolerance to pain. Again, this is a gut condition that very directly affects the brain. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is how do we make the body healthier and also therefore make the brain healthier and make the symptoms of autism less. So there's three main kind of buckets that I think of for autism, and every child is different, and their different buckets might be different sizes, their capacity or imbalances might be different, but in general, it's typically the immune system that regulates the ability to fight viruses and pathogens and regulate inflammation. We look at digestion, which is a huge component for a lot of kids, but not everybody with autism has gut issues, but still can benefit from the use of diet. And detoxification is also another area, and so we're more likely to be damaged by those toxins if we have autism. And all of these conditions directly affect our neurology or our neurological function and our brain function and our behavior and other conditions. So this is a chart from my book, and I'm not going to go through it. I think I spent like 40 pages or something on it in my book, but I'll just give you, I think, the most important parts for today. And by the way, if the biochemistry part's too much for you, you can completely skip through it and go to the second and third sections. It's there for people that want that, but it's not required. But the nice thing, I think, what I like to do, because I have parents of all different levels typically in the audience, how many of you are doing special diet right now? And how many of you are not doing a special diet yet? Okay, and so that's pretty common in most audiences I go to. And so what I want to share today are just a few of the basics. So you may have heard in some of the talks this weekend, the top part is methylation, the bottom part is transsulfuration, and we need all of this working in order for that little orange box at the very bottom to work. And so you can imagine we need dozens of nutrients. The top box, we need folate and B12, we need B6 and magnesium and zinc and all sorts of things for this system to work. And if our biochemistry is a little bit hindered for genetic reasons or toxin overload reasons or whatever it might be, we might even have a more difficult time. Anyway, the little orange box processes something called salicylates or phenols. And so when we get to some of the diets like the Feingold diet and the fail-safe diet, you'll see that you need a lot of biochemistry working in order to be able to process certain things like fruits and vegetables, particularly fruits like apples and grapes and things like that. So we're going to talk and help you become your own detective so that you can start to figure out what are my child's biggest challenges. What foods do they like? Which ones do they not? Which ones do they crave? Cravings is usually a bad sign, but not always. But if someone's crazy about something, that's usually a red flag for me that you might want to dig further to see if there's maybe a challenge in that area. So that's all I want to share about the biochemistry, and that the children that we see with autism in clinical experience are often deficient in all of these areas. So glutathione, the bottom left box, that handles our ability to handle inflammation and detoxify and have a good immune system and digest. And the same thing, very similar to the box over on the right. So we need these systems working, and we know that with children with autism, they don't, or in people. And if I say children, it's only because often parents will come when their child's newly diagnosed. And so obviously you have adult children, and there might even be some people with autism in the audience. So I mean to include all of them. Okay, so to me, autism and people with autism are the canaries in the coal mine. They're really telling us that our world is too toxic, it's too deficient in nutrients, it's causing changes in genetics, and it's causing a lot of problems. And this, to me, this model, these are the kids that are the most sensitive. They need the best quality nutrients. They need the most pure diet. And actually, a lot of the principles that apply for autism absolutely apply to ADHD, asthma, allergies, anxiety, all sorts of different conditions. I mean, I have moms that come by and they've got autoimmune conditions, and a lot of the similar properties of good foods and special diets really applies to. So to me, they're the canaries in the coal mine, and we can learn a lot from them, and it can help other members of our family as well. So as we improve the body and its systems, we help support learning and behavior. So we're going to talk a lot today about food in relationship to digestive wellness, because the GI tract is essential for good health. So Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, said that all disease begins in the gut, and everything I've ever seen points me in that exact direction. If your gut is, I would challenge you to find somebody that has an unhealthy gut that is a healthy person. So the gut is the starting point, and especially because food is the one thing that goes through the gut all the time, and that food can either support the gut or cause harm and challenges to the gut and the body. So that's where a lot of our food choices come back to making decisions about this. The immune system, the largest part of the immune system is in the gut. A large part of neurotransmitters like serotonin can be found in the gut, and we need to be able to break down those foods. So again, even if you don't have obvious symptoms of gut imbalance, we still, all of us, still need to be able to break down our foods. We need to eat healthy foods, but we are not necessarily what we eat, we are what we digest. So we need digestion working well, and we need to get those good nutrients in. Okay, so nutrition is essential for nourishing the brain, the body, and even our genes. So I want to briefly talk about that. So there are some studies done on, there's these special mice, they're called agouti mice, and these mice, they're either brown or yellow, and the yellow ones are the kind of, the unhealthy ones. They're big, they're obese, and it's very easy to see because when the offspring are born, they'll either be brown or yellow, and the yellow ones we know are the ones that have certain genes turned in the kind of negative direction. So let me share a little more, let me explain. We have a genetic code, and we can't change that, but we also have something called, the study of epigenetics is looking at how we actually can turn genes on or off in response to our environment so that we can adapt more rapidly. So we know from these mice that you can, what you feed a mom during pregnancy and what you eat throughout your lifetime can turn these genes on or off. And they might go on or off. It depends on what kind of gene it is, but they can either go in the health-promoting direction or the disease-promoting direction. And as you can imagine, when they give the mice good nutrients like those methyl donors, things like zinc, B12, folate, those types of things, we see the healthy genes turned on. So we know that nutrients turns us in the good direction, toxins and nutrient deficiencies turns us in the negative disease-promoting direction. So food and nutrition actually is really important. Not only does it make us healthy, but it actually can affect our genetics. And this is, I think, very powerful. So the standard American diet, or what we would call the SAD diet, is as exactly how it sounds. Nearly 2/3 of children don't meet the RDA for vitamin E and zinc. And by the way, the RDA is the minimum amount. It's the required daily allowance. It's the minimum amount we need to prevent disease from setting in. So 2/3 don't meet the minimum for zinc and in vitamin E. Half didn't meet it for calcium. 1/3 didn't meet it for iron or B6. And only 1% of children actually ate the recommendations of the food pyramid, which, according to my beliefs, are not very stringent. So we can see that not even people with autism that might have more deficiencies and more need for nutrients, but all of our children are not, on average, meeting these important needs, as well as pregnant women from the foods that they eat. So that means that we are starting at a big deficit. And if we look at our peers and we say, well, my child's doing pretty well compared to the kids in their class, it doesn't mean that much. We need to elevate our standards a bit above the standard American diet. Those nutrients that I just mentioned that were deficient in a lot of kids, I'll just briefly tell you, they are very important for neurological and cognitive function. I won't go through all of them, but you can see what they do. So they help with motor function and neurological symptoms and development and neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters are those, brain chemicals that make us think and feel good. Brain function and learning and genetic expression and all of that. So you can imagine if most children aren't meeting the minimum requirements to prevent disease from setting in, we are certainly not meeting the optimal needs for all of this to work. And so on average, children today don't get enough nutrients to build neurotransmitters, to have adequate fuel, and for energy and motor function, for a strong immune system, for that genetics, for cellular function, for brain function, for growth and repair, and for myelinating and kind of insulating the nerves for good conductivity. So it's really not a surprise that our children today are having so many challenges, and this just shows us even more the importance of getting that good nutrition in. I know that it's not easy when you have a picky eater and you have somebody with autism, but I'm firstly here to share how essential it is, and then we're going to talk about how to help you do that. So how can diet help? Well, to break it out a little bit, we can support digestion and biochemistry in a number of ways. So if we have what's called leaky gut, or basically gut inflammation where the digestive system is not breaking things down and allowing the proper absorption of nutrients, we can remove the foods that are causing a problem and causing inflammation. We can add good supportive foods that help to supply good bacteria and help to reduce that inflammation and help to heal up the gut. When we have deficiencies, we want to do two things. We want to increase the nutrition in the diet, and we want to make sure that that food is digestible as possible and work on digestion as well. When we have yeast overgrowth, which is really common if you get a lot of antibiotics, and lots of kids with autism have a little bit of a depressed immune system, so a lot of them have more antibiotics and more yeast than the average person. So for those kids, then we're looking at removing sugars, removing foods, maybe reducing the refined carbohydrate, deficient snacks and things, and adding good fermented or what we call probiotic-rich foods to help kind of crowd out and rebalance the system. When we have toxicity, we want to be careful of the toxins all around us, but for our conversation today, particularly the ones that come in our foods, so food additives, and the way we cook and store our food. And when our chemistry isn't working properly, we might need to remove certain foods like those phenols and salicylates I mentioned, and we might do some additional supplementation to help maybe sort of bypass some of the blockages, or I shouldn't say blockages, but sort of the less efficient pathways or less working pathways. So healing diets, in my opinion, in my perspective, have two parts to them. Now, all healing diets pretty much have one part, which is the first part. And it's the crucial part. It's what all special diets are based on. A gluten-free diet removes gluten. A specific carbohydrate diet removes grains and starches. A low oxalate diet removes oxalate. So you get the point. So it's about removing the offending food for that person. And that's the crucial first step. But we can't forget about good nutrition because of all the reasons we discussed that nutrition helps nourish our system. So part 2 of all healing diets is always work on getting that good nutrition in that is going to help us take that next step. So what do parents report when they do a special diet? So it can vary greatly. So sometimes it's profound differences. So I'll give you some profound examples because they always kind of hit home for people. So I had a client that went from 0 to 200 words. He was 3. He had no language, and 3 months on the gluten-free and casein-free diet, he had 200 words. I know another dad who, after 3 days on the gluten-free and casein-free diet, his son had the very first interactive back and forth conversation. So a lot of times, sometimes I hear language as one of those first things. The very first thing I often hear is digestion improving, if that's a concern or a problem for a child. And that makes sense because you're removing the foods that are coming in contact with that gut that are causing that inflammation. So that's often something we see, but we see language, attention, learning, hyperactivity improve, eye contact improve, better sleep. I know a boy who's a teen, who's 15, who didn't get potty trained until he had gastroenterologist help him with his gut, and then very quickly he was. So a lot of times these things have multifacets to them. And so sometimes it's these dramatic changes, but sometimes it's just step-by-step improvements as you go. And so I'm here to share just the wide range of possibility that exists. All right, so this is my book, Nourishing Hope for Autism. Actually, the cover, we just redid the cover a little bit, but it's more or less, looks the same, and it's the same inside. And we're going to go through, in the book, there's a 12-step guide. And that 12-step guide is going to take us, we're going to go through like half of this today and talk about how you, as parents and even professionals, can help people go step by step and change the diet. So the first one is cleaning up the diet. And I think this is the easiest, best place to start. So these are some of the top things that I would take out of a diet that really can cause major challenges for kids. So artificial additives, so food additives like artificial colors, flavors, preservatives. We know from a study done in The Lancet in 2007 that children get hyperactivity from these artificial additives. And so this has actually been studied, and we know this to be true. Now, again, if you have autism and you have some more impaired detoxification, you might even get more severe symptoms. You might get aggression or headaches, and then you might not even be able to explain that you have a headache. So these things are really a challenge, and really very easy to get rid of, because if I take off my nutrition hat for a minute, you can find any food, cookies, candy, whatever, you name it, that's free of artificial additives. You just probably need to spend more money. And the reason they're more expensive is because, for example, vanilla, natural vanilla, is 50 times more expensive than artificial vanilla. So a lot of companies will use these foods for profit reasons or for shelf life reasons, not for the health of your kids reasons. So you can switch anything over, even without addressing a broccoli or anything else. And sometimes it can make a huge difference. And you might notice that moms or dads in the audience that maybe get migraines or other challenges, ADHD, you might see these improve for yourself and other family members as well. MSG is monosodium glutamate. Glutamate's excitatory neurotransmitter. It tells your brain this food tastes really good, eat more. The challenge is that excitatory neurotransmitter does exactly what it sounds like. It creates excitement and hyperactivity in the brain, and you don't have that natural ability to have GABA come in and balance and calm that back out. And so these can also be a really big problem, creating everything from headaches to hyperactivity to all sorts of challenges. And these are usually in meat-flavored or cheese-flavored foods. It's a way to make a product very inexpensive and give it that flavor without actually having to use the expensive ingredients to do so. Pesticides, they're neurotoxins. That's how they kill the bug. We don't want any toxins. We want to avoid pesticides and buy organic whenever we can. Artificial sweeteners are just another thing. The body doesn't know how to process them. They can be very problematic. So I always recommend just avoiding them all. The trans fats, we're going to talk, and you've probably heard about fish oils and all these good fats we need for the brain. But these trans fats they are completely counter to that. So they compete for the cell receptors and affect our ability to get nutrients and all sorts of things in and out of the cell, and really are a problem. So partially hydrogenated oils and some of the commercial peanut butters and mayonnaises and those kinds of things. Again, you can find the foods without those. You just have to choose different brands. And then being careful of added sugar, and particularly high amounts of sugar and high fructose corn syrup, as well as, and to me, things to avoid on a diet would also include anything the child is allergic or sensitive to. So this is a good first step. If you can't get everything organic, you can just start with the Dirty Dozen. These are the environmental working group. They test all conventional produce for pesticides, and these are the top pesticide foods. So for example, like if I can't find something, I know like I live in California, so we have access to a lot of produce, but if it's out of season or something, I can't find strawberries, I just won't give them to her unless they're organic. So these I make different choices for than maybe something else where the pesticide amount is less. So ideally you buy everything organic, but if you can't, know that these are the ones with the most pesticides. Sugar. So sugar will feed yeast, which is a common challenge with people with autism. It depresses the immune system and it increases inflammation. These are three big areas that people with autism struggle with. And so sugar is just gonna feed all of those challenges. So avoiding refined sugars is step number one, because refined sugars don't have any nutrients to help process them. But even the natural ones, if you consume them in large amounts, are going to do the same thing, whether it's fruit or raw honey or anything. But there are some that are better than others, and as long as you keep them low, those are good starting points. And some people might really need to really restrict the sugar if they've got yeast or some other challenge. So looking at step number 2 is cleaning up the home. So this is big because people with autism, as I mentioned, have a bit impaired detoxification frequently. And so many of you might have had the experience that you go into a mall and there's perfume around, or somebody around you has some, or someone's smoking around you, and you get a headache or you get nauseous. That's because we're actually inhaling the fumes. Those go into the bloodstream and the liver has to detoxify them. And if we can't detoxify them quickly enough, we will get symptoms. Well, our people with autism, our kids with autism often can't tell us what's going on and how they feel, and so they might be acting up and we might not know why. So getting rid of that stuff, it has no benefit. It's going to burden up the liver for all of us, and so I say get rid of all of that room fresheners, fragrances, perfumes, even the stuff you might use, hair products. Sometimes they're really strong and they will, for some kids, create really big challenges. Flame retardants, so infant car seats and clothing, sleepwear, things like that, will have toxic antimony. So like for my baby, I just put her in regular clothes to go to sleep rather than sleepwear that has to have those flame retardants. Fabric softeners, they're really strong chemicals in there, and anything that you put on your skin will absorb into your skin and into your bloodstream. So I always think if I would never consider eating it, then I'm not going to put it on my skin. So just think about that before. I mean, maybe it's a bit of an extreme example, but it really starts to get you to think, what's in this, and do I really want it touching my skin or my child's skin where it's going to absorb? Sunscreens, you don't want to get a sunburn, but you really have to be careful. There are some that have some chemicals that are, in my opinion, and the studies that I've seen, harmful, and so you might choose the healthier ones. And for us, a lot of times, I'll set my timer for like 20 minutes, and in my family, we can stay out in the sun for 20 minutes without getting sunburn. So I want her to get some vitamin D. So I want to balance vitamin D with getting a sunburn. I don't want her to get a sunburn, but I don't want to just always slather her body, because then we're not getting vitamin D, and we know that vitamin D actually is one of the suspected challenges with autism. Toothpaste and flea treatments and things that your pets might have, and in our food supply as well. So the artificial additives, cookware. So we'll go into some of this today. The pots and pans you use, storing in plastic containers, and those artificial additives I mentioned. Step number 3 is some basic supplementation. So these are some of the common nutrient deficiencies that practitioners often see deficient in people with autism. Minerals, vitamins, B vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins A and D, antioxidants, things like that. And the deficiencies can stem from many places. One is the standard American diet and a poor consumption of good quality foods. The second one is restrictive and picky eating, but also you have to be able to digest those foods. The cell has to be able to utilize that nutrient. We have to be able to convert it to the active form to be able to utilize it. We need enough nutrients to do that. If we have inflammation and other things, that's going to burn up and use up our good nutrients without our body actually getting to do the good stuff it needs to. It's just fighting a fire with them and never gets to use them for the things we need it for. And also, if we don't have enough good bacteria, that good bacteria actually makes certain nutrients. So all of these kinds of things can create deficiencies. So it's not surprising at all to me that children today and children with autism have deficiencies. So we can look at food and supplementation to support us. So food, to me, is the foundation of good nutrition, because nature knows exactly the right way to combine things. So, for example, an orange has vitamin C, but it has 161 other nutrients, phytonutrients, cofactors that help the absorption of the vitamin C. So it's fine to take a vitamin C in a capsule, but it's different than when you get it from your food. And if your food isn't very good, you can't make up those deficiencies very well. It's a good place to start, but you want to start with the food and then add supplementation on top of it as you need to make up the gaps. So calcium on a dairy-free diet, or maybe some iodine or various nutrients, calcium, magnesium, zinc, B vitamins, things like that you need. And so supplements are a helpful part for people with autism. So these are some of the first supplements I would consider. So digestive enzymes, they are wonderful for helping us to break down our food. So if our gut is impaired, we often don't release, and we're not able to have those enzymes get contact with the food to break those down. So enzymes can help do that for us, and there are some special enzymes we'll talk about that even help with gluten and dairy. Probiotics are that good bacteria. And I'm going to talk about fermented foods, but also if your kids are picky eaters, you can start with and supplement extra with probiotics to get that good bacteria that might have been wiped out or that we just need to get in every day, and many of us don't. Calcium, particularly important on a dairy-free diet. Magnesium's another big one. Magnesium and B6 were studied heavily by Dr. Bernard Rimland and found really wonderful benefits and results for people with autism. B12 and folate, we know, are really important to that methylation cycle. Cod liver oil or some sort of omega-3. And then, the top 8 are often, a lot of times I'll suggest individual supplements one at a time, because sometimes if you take something with 27 things and you have a reaction, you don't know why. So sometimes it's nice to start with individual ones, and it's also sometimes less flavorful, so you can at least start getting a few in while you're working on getting a multivitamin in. So either way will work depending on the child. All right, so now if we go into some of the diet basics, I want to talk about what good nutrition looks like. So this is my autism food pyramid. I want to share it with you today. So I don't do one diet. I work with all the special diets. I talk about 13 special diets in my book. We're going to talk about 5 or 6 of them today. What I want to say here is that I spent some time about a year ago really looking at what do all the diets have in common? What do these children have in common? How do we make the foods most easily digestible, most nutrient dense, and least likely to cause reactions? And what are those foods and what are those diets? What foods do all those diets have most in common? So the bottom is meats and vegetables. And then beyond that, there's the good fats for the brain. So kind of prioritizing this in a hierarchy. Then there's fruits, and I just break them out because if I put fruits and vegetables together, people would eat all fruits and no vegetables. I really want to highlight the power and the benefit of vegetables. Nuts and seeds are wonderful. They've got great nutrients in them, but for some kids, they're a little more inflammatory. They've got some oxalates, some things that might inhibit digestion, and they might have a little more trouble digesting them. So they're also a form of protein and a form of fat, and they're a good thing to include in your diet if you're not allergic to them. But I'm breaking the animal fats out from the plant-based fats because the plant-based fats are a little more difficult to digest if you have some impaired digestion. So the top of the pyramid are grains and beans because these are, again, the most difficult. They also have high oxalates, high phytates, high lectins, and all I'll say about this is they're very inflammatory and they inhibit digestion and they make it hard to digest these foods. So we're actually going to talk about how to make these foods at the top of the pyramid most digestible. So if you can eat them, you can eat them and digest them better. So soaking them and doing things like that with them. So some people are going to eat all of these foods and they're all good nutrient-dense foods. Some people might choose a special diet and decide, well, I'm going to do the paleo diet or the specific carbohydrate diet, so I'm going to take off the top of the pyramid. So it's more of a hierarchy of choosing and helping you kind of make some of these determinations. And then the right-hand side, the little sidebar, is dairy, which while I think it has a lot of good nutrition, if you're creating inflammation and you can't digest it, that's not going to work. So it's kind of one of those optional things. And most kids with autism will avoid dairy. And then some of them might even avoid starches if they're on a special diet like the specific carbohydrate diet. So you can see it's kind of a hierarchy. And the bottom are all the nutrient-dense principles, grass-fed, getting broths and ferments and soaking and juicing, things like that in the diet. So we're going to go through some of this now, talk about the animal protein. So you can get all of your amino acids from plant-based protein, but you have to combine things together, whereas, just in a day, not in a meal or something, so it's not too complicated. But animal protein's nice because you got all your essential amino acids, and they're a little bit easier for most people to digest. Now, everybody has different needs. People with high ammonia or other challenges might need to choose different proteins. They might need to choose more plant than animal, but for the most part, animal protein is easier to digest and has more has more amino acids all in one place. So this is a good place because we need protein. It's the building blocks for everything. It's the building blocks for growth, repair, neurotransmitters, everything. It's also high in things like zinc and iron, which actually help with building neurotransmitters, helping us be healthy, helping us have good brain function and that kind of thing. And so they're naturally rich in that. So depending on, again, what you're sensitive to or allergic to, you might make certain choices than others. I'm going to talk a little bit more about organ meats like liver, which we'll talk about how to make it kid-friendly, bone broths, things like that. Vegetables. So vegetables are, to me, key. They have lots of really important nutrients in them. So I suggest getting a wide range of different nutrients, colors. So red, yellow, green, purple are going to have all different phytochemicals and vitamins and minerals. And so getting a wide range of colors will actually help you keep a nice nutrient-dense diet. We'll talk a little bit about leafy greens because they always get a little bit of attention, but nobody ever really knows what to do with them, so they kind of say yeah, and then nothing happens. So greens are one of my favorites. They're high in lots of important iron, folate, calcium, all sorts of things. So how to cook with them? Well, You can add them to smoothies. And in my cookbook and also on my website, I've got a smoothie recipe that includes kale. It's actually really delicious. As long as your child doesn't mind green, then you wouldn't even know there was kale. It doesn't taste at all like kale. So some of my clients will put it in like a dark cup so their kid doesn't know what color it is. You can saute them. I like to fry them up with some like ground pork, and I can even get them kind of crispy, which is kind of delicious. They're almost like fried in there. We're going to talk about quality of meat, though, because the quality, I should have mentioned, the quality of the animal protein is essential. So a conventional versus a grass-fed is a world of difference in terms of nutrient composition. So when I'm thinking of pork, I'm thinking of heirloom pastured pork, the best of the best. Looking at kale, you can make kale chips. You can add them to soups and stews or saute them with any other vegetables if your child will eat them. And I have a lot more ideas for greens and vegetables in my cookbook. All right, so going on to fats. So fats are important for the brain, really important. Breast milk is 53%, 25% saturated fat. Every sex and stress hormone is... well, we'll get to that in a minute. I'll come back to that. But they're important for hormones. They're important for the cell. We know that omega-3s help with depression. The fish oils, those kinds of things, help with hyperactivity and inflammation. And what I like to say about, when I think about humans, I like to think about what does nature create for babies? And it's breast milk. So if it's 53% fat, we know that babies need this fat. Their brain is mostly made up of fat, and they are getting a lot of fat because their brain is growing when they're children. We also need that fat as we go. And in fact, interestingly, 25% is actually saturated fat. So we'll talk about that too. So there's all kinds. There's fish oils, plant-based oils, avocados and olive oils and coconut oil. There's animal fats, dairy fat if you're not allergic to it or sensitive to it. And I always recommend avoiding the canola oils and the refined oxidized oils. But I want to take a little more time to talk about saturated fat, because you've probably already heard about monounsaturated and why it's good, but saturated fat gets really villainized in the mainstream. Saturated fat is really important for brain development, hence the reason that breast milk has so much of it. It's important for the bones and the liver and the lungs, the immune system. And so getting saturated fat is important. Now, you can get saturated fat from plants. You can get it from coconut. It's a wonderful saturated fat. It has antiviral, antifungal properties to it. It's easily absorbed without using digestion, so it's even helpful for people that don't digest well. Has really great properties. But I also want to talk about animal fat, because animal fat also has good things in it. So, animal fat has, as we all know, saturated fat, but most animal fat's actually 50% monounsaturated fat. People don't really talk about that. There's also essential fatty acids in there, like DHA in eggs and things. The other crucial thing I'll say, and probably my favorite thing about animal fat, is that it has fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and K. So, they are crucial for the absorption of minerals. And Dr. Weston A. Price studied some of these traditional cultures, and he found that you could actually starve from minerals that are abundant in the diet because you don't have vitamin A and D to help it absorb. Vitamin A and D come from animals. So animals like us, we make vitamin A from things like beta carotene, and we make D from the sun, which is why I said getting sun is so important. But we don't always do that conversion very well, especially children don't make that conversion to vitamin A very efficiently. So if you eat animal foods, they've done it for you as long as they're grass-fed. So that's where those important things. We also need these good fat-soluble vitamins for the absorption of the protein that's in them. So you can actually become protein deficient if you're getting high protein, if you do low-fat, high protein. So you want to get some fat with your protein. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll mention cholesterol because these are a bit of the ones that are villainized in the mainstream. And there is a great book. If you've heard that cholesterol is bad, there is an amazing book. I think it was great. I couldn't put it down. It was like a murder mystery without the murder. and it's all about cholesterol. It's called Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. And he talks all about basically the history of science and how, long story short, once you form a hypothesis and a theory and it gets picked up by your peers, if you come out with a study and it shows something different, there's not only peer pressure and sort of this this need to make everything consistent, but it's just basically there are a lot of studies that show that cholesterol is really good and really important, but they get kind of sidelined because of this phenomenon in human nature. But cholesterol is really important for brain growth, brain development, and function. Every sex and stress hormone is made from a cholesterol molecule. We need those. 75% of the cholesterol in our body we make in the liver. So if we eat more, our liver usually just makes a little less. It's actually sugar, inflammation, and these inflammatory markers that they're actually finding are creating heart disease, not so much the saturated fat and these kinds of fats and cholesterol. Cholesterol actually has benefits in the body, and children need it. In fact, they found that children with autism have often low cholesterol. And I don't know if you heard Dr. Hamilton speak yesterday, but she actually talks about this. And there are practitioners that will supplement cholesterol because some of the children are so low that it's creating some serious behavior and other problems for them. So I just want to say these are not the evil enemy, but we do need to get good quality. All right. So we'll talk about a few of the boosters and the foundations here. So grass-fed, I kind of talked a bit about it. It's going to be higher in the fat-soluble vitamins, the good fatty acids, things like that. Conventional animals are kept in confinement so they don't get sunlight. They eat corn and soy, and those are not part of their native diet. They don't eat grass, so they don't convert it to vitamin A or vitamin K. And their fats, because they become unhealthy, these fats are much more inflammatory. So you have an animal food that is deficient in fats, fatty acids, deficient in fat-soluble vitamins, and not very healthy for us. Whereas grass-fed is the opposite. Organic is better. It's not going to have the hormones, the pesticides, all the terrible other stuff that they tend to have in the conventional, but it's not grass-fed. And you want 100% grass-fed because most of the time, even if it says grass-fed, it's grain-finished. And when you grain-finish it for the last 60 days, they do that so that it tastes more like what people expect it to taste like. Grass-fed is a little gamier, so people like that, not that flavor. So they grain finish it. But when you grain finish it, you turn all those profiles back to the old profiles, or much, much more closely to the old ones, and so you're missing all those nutrients again. So that's why, because of the nutrition, the lack of all of the additives, hormones, all the stuff that they give the conventional ones, grass-fed's going to be the best way to go. And just to give you an example, the Weston A. Price Foundation tested some of these foods and found 8 times the vitamin D and twice the vitamin A in eggs. They found 3 times the vitamin D and 10 times the vitamin A in butter. If you can't do butter because you're casein-free, there is a form of ghee that's certified casein-free, which is called Purity Farms. So if you can't do butter, you could do ghee, and you could get a lot of these same benefits. Lard, again, 12 times the vitamin D in pastured. So you can see that even though you might spend twice as much or maybe even 3 times as much for a pastured egg, you might get twice or 8 times the nutritional value out of it. So it is actually a very nutrient-dense food. So this is a great one for kids. So if they will not eat vegetables, but they'll eat animal foods, you just make those animal foods as nutritious as possible, and you'll get some really important nutrients that way. And then you work on getting the vegetables in. Broths. So broths, when you put bones in a broth or vegetables in a broth, you create ionic minerals, and those are the way that the body absorbs them. It's very easy to absorb that way. They're also rich in gelatin. Gelatin helps digestion. And so we can increase the nutrition of our food by adding broths to things. Yeah. I do, yeah. She asked if you have to cut the bones. Well, you want to expose the bones to the water, and you want to have some vinegar. So the vinegar is the acid that will leach the calcium and magnesium out of the bones. So we can chop up the bones, and we'll actually talk about that in the cooking part, is better. So that's the broths. The fermentation. So good So fermented foods are rich in probiotics, or good bacteria, and they are really important for all of these things. Getting the bowels not too fast, not too slow, making B vitamins, breaking down the sugars, helping with the immune system, helping with inflammation. Fermented foods are one of my very favorites. And if you can't do dairy, which is the one we think of yogurt, then you can do non-dairy yogurts. You can do raw sauerkraut. I'll talk about how to make it kid-friendly. You can do some of the young coconut kefirs or things like that. Okay, juicing. Bottled juices are deficient in a lot of nutrients when they're pasteurized and stored. So if you freshly pressed juices, that's a great way. And picky eaters, this is really good because a lot of times they don't like the texture of vegetables, and this takes the texture away and gives you just concentrated nutrients, and typically they like them. So that's a great way to go. All right, so just to summarize a bit, nourishing practices: choosing grass-fed animal foods and organic vegetables, including plenty of good fats, eating fermented foods, getting your bone broths and your vegetable broths in, drinking some good fresh-pressed juices, some raw foods, some smoothie type things, getting pure water and mineral-rich salt that we didn't actually have time to go into. There's a couple things. I actually have a 2-hour presentation on the food pyramid, and you can find out more about it at my booth, and I go into each one of these more. And the soaking and the sprouting of the grains and the beans helps with that digestibility. And then what I would call the top nourishers would be eggs or egg yolks, the liver and the organ meats, and very briefly, people always ask, well, isn't liver the filtering organ? Well, sure, but it also handles like 200 functions. So it's kind of, I think about the liver, it's got its own like tool belt, and it's got all of these nutrients at its disposal. So it's really rich in iron and zinc and vitamin C and vitamin A because it's using these nutrients to do all these things. So as long as you're not like us, if we were living in a polluted place and we ate junky food, our liver would be sluggish and full of toxins probably. But the liver doesn't store toxins, it detoxifies them. So it shouldn't be filled with toxins if we get good grass-fed liver. Dairy or ghee, bone broths, fermented foods, vegetable juices, and the fish oils. And by the way, fish eggs are one of my very favorites, and they're one of my daughters. Since 10 months old, she has loved fish eggs. So if you have little ones and you're not concerned about food allergies in your family, a lot of them love fish eggs, especially if you start them when they're younger. Okay, now let's go on to some of the diets here. I'll just briefly talk about the diets, and you can ask me more questions. We're going to talk, these are the diets, but we're just going to talk about a few of them right now. So there's gluten-free and casein-free. So there's food allergies and there's food sensitivities, and if your doctor said, well, your child's not allergic to dairy or wheat, that's different than a sensitivity. And often what we're thinking of in autism, while you can have an allergy, we're usually talking about sensitivities. This delayed response that creates chronic things like diarrhea, constipation, anxiety, hyperactivity, things like that. So gluten and casein, they have these IgG reactions that create a lot of inflammation and problems. You can make those opiates I mentioned. They have inflammatory and autoimmune responses. If you have celiac, it's an autoimmune response to gluten. And so typically you can test for these things, and there are some great tests, and Great Plains has an opiate test, and they're all good data. But in the end, there's so many ways you can react and respond. The best thing to typically do is try the diet for a period of time and see how your child reacts. But you need to do the diet 100% if you're going to do that. Because if you have any infractions, you might not see the benefit, and therefore you'll never really know if it was helpful or not. So one of the things that we need to do is break those proteins down into those little amino acids. And people with autism often have some impaired digestion. DPP-4 gets damaged by mercury and pesticides, as well as I'm sure other things we haven't identified yet. We need that DPP-4 to prevent that opiate from being created. And we see a lot of these symptoms of opiate use. These are symptoms of opiate use, the same ones we see very often in autism. So, and we know that in the urine of children with autism, they produce often higher levels of these opiates. So you can get a digestive enzyme, that's often a good place to start, with some DPP-4 that will help to break down the foods, the fats, the carbs, the protein, and help break down that those opiates. Our sponsor I mentioned is Houston Enzymes. I really like their enzymes. I've used them for a long time, and so I wanted to share them with you. You can find a brochure at our table if you want more, but this is often a good place to get started. Before you even start the diet, some people will start with enzymes. Now, there are some people that can do the enzymes without the diet, but my experience is you won't really know if, I just feel that, you really need to do the diet 100%, and the enzymes can help. There are some people that can do the enzymes alone, but I really feel like you want to try the diet and give the good diet a shot and use the enzymes as support. And here's just some of the studies that were done on opiates and gluten and casein for autism, and these are just some of them. So when people tell you there's no science and research, that's not true. There is tons of research, and more is being done every day. So gluten-containing grains, wheat, rye, those kinds of things, casein, milk, all animal milk of all animals. I'm going to go kind of quickly because I want to make sure we get through everything. Soy. Soy is broken down by the same enzyme. It's very inflammatory to the gut. So it's also broken down by DPP-4, so I pretty much suggest all gluten and casein-free, as well as soy-free. Corn is another big problem. You might see some people handle it, some people don't. That might be something you need to remove, but it's individual. Okay, just a little on these others because I don't want to overwhelm you. But I do a webinar called the pitfalls of special diets. So I want to just share a little bit of things with you here. The specific carbohydrate diet helps very frequently with digestive issues. When you can't break down carbohydrates, which we know people with autism have a bit of a challenge with, or more of a challenge with, is we remove the disaccharides and the polysaccharides and only do the monosaccharide carbohydrates, which are fruit and non-starchy vegetables and a little bit of honey. So there's no grains, no corn, no potatoes. It's much more strict than GFCF, but it's often very helpful. But there's lots of great things that you can eat. And for people that don't get a benefit that they're looking for from GFCF, sometimes they'll progress to one of these diets, SCD or GAPS, and that can really make the difference that they need. The phenols and salicylates are processed by these pathways, and we often see hyperactivity, red cheeks, red ears, things like that. So those are the classic symptoms, and they're in things like apples, grapes, raisins, and berries. So a lot of times parents will say, I'm so thrilled at least my child eats fruit. The challenge, and that's great, unless you can't process the phenols and you're craving these foods and it's creating sleeping issues and hyperactivity and aggression, then they're not going to work for you, at least until you maybe balance the biochemistry and then see if you can tolerate them better. So just be aware, like if I have a child that eats like mustard and Indian spices, which are fine, but ketchup, I start to question. So if you look in my book over there later, you'll see some of the lists in the back of the book, and you can kind of get a sense. I like to look at what does your child really crave and is almost addicted to, and then are there any commonalities with symptoms and the food list? And that kind of gives you a clue if any of these other diets are relevant. I also talk in my book, since I don't have a ton of time, which diets you can combine, which ones you have to do 100%, which ones you can just incorporate principles. So on the oxalate diet, I want to talk just a little bit about this. There was a study done last year. Long story short, they found that there was a 3-fold greater plasma oxalate in children with autism. And what they found was that the oxalate level, they screened out gut kids and all these other kids, and they just looked at just autism and found this much higher level. And interestingly, consistent with a condition where people that have a genetic oxalate issue was consistent with that. And at this level, these oxalates can create a lot of damage, and they were really surprised to find this problem with oxalates. So the low oxalate diet and the oxalate principles is probably one of my very favorites. Oxalate can bind to calcium and form crystals that have these sharp edges that can create pain and inflammation when they're bound to the calcium. But when they're unbound, they're actually even more harmful because they can get into the cell, they can affect mitochondrial function, they can disrupt minerals, and they can create oxidative stress, which we know is very common. So you can make oxalate in the body, or you can get oxalate from your food, and that just depends on the person. Also, good bacteria breaks it down, leaky gut will allow it to absorb, so a lot of times there's multiple factors that might be creating an oxalate issue. And then there are diets that are great, like the specific carbohydrate diet is great. But if we focus too much on the nut flours, we might be getting a lot of oxalate in the presence of a leaky gut, and for some people that can really be problematic. So it is something to consider. The Autism Oxalate Project, Susan Owens is an amazing researcher at lowoxalate.info. You can find tons more information on that. Okay, picky eaters. So you can have a lot of issues with picky eating. I'm going to talk about the ones that might be related to food and nutrition. You know, I'm not a feeding therapist, but there's sensory issues and there's anxiety issues and all these other things that also come into play. So getting support from a feeding therapist or an OT or a speech therapist that can do some assessment as to whether it's medical or physical or oral motor is really helpful. But from my perspective, there's other things to look at. So I've talked to a lot of you this weekend, and this is a very common experience. Your child is a picky eater and eats 5 things, and those 5 things are all wheat and dairy-based foods. And the number one reason for that is because they self-select into the foods that are creating those opiates for them. They don't realize that, but those foods make them feel calm and feel good. When they eat the other foods, that doesn't happen. And in fact, they need those opiate foods to continue to feel good, so they are not going to want the other foods. They're not going to be interested in vegetables and other things very much. So to me, those opiates are one of the causes of potential picky eating. Also, the chemicals, the MSG, the artificial additives, also create that excitement and that interest in the food, but again, can be a source of very specific kind of picky eating single brands that might be filled with those artificial things. Zinc deficiency will create poor sense of smell, sense of taste, and appetite. And so if everything tastes like mushy cardboard, why would you ever eat vegetables? There's no point. So sometimes once you work on the gut, sometimes you get good nutrition in, you get that zinc up, that can help with picky eating for some kids. Also, yeast and other microorganisms will cause sugar cravings and carb cravings. And so kids that gravitate only to carb foods, that's something to consider. So to me, there are some biochemical reasons in addition to all the other reasons. And so looking at these things can really help. So my experience from a vast majority of my clients is once they get out the opiate foods, particularly, because I bet you that's probably the most common scenario here, once you get out the gluten and the casein, they will often not only eat the gluten-free and casein-free foods, but they'll start eating more meat, more vegetables. This is the vast experience from parents I talk to all over. Now, it's not always the case, and if you have a super picky eater, you want to get some support. You don't want to just assume that they're going to eventually eat. But for the most part, most kids do, and they will expand their diet. So some ideas: removing the addictive foods, increasing nutrient status, and to me, one of the biggest ones is texture. I'm always working on creative ways to get good texture, and I talk about it extensively. I have a picky eater webinar. I have 3. I have lots of ideas in my cookbook, and it's all about making that. If meat is too chewy, you can do chicken pancakes. If vegetables are too mushy, you can make them crispy and crunchy. You can also incorporate and hide things in your food, but the challenge there is if you have a super picky eater that eats 4 things, and one of them is meatballs, and you add something to it, and they say, I'm rejecting that meatball forever now, then you are sort of stuck. So you're better off building trust, and if you've got a child that you think you can incorporate these vegetables and things in, most of my clients, that works just great. But if you have what they call a problem feeder that eats only 5 or 10 foods, you don't want to mess with that food by hiding things in because you don't want to lose a food. So that's where the feeding therapist can be supportive. And visual presentation. All right, so while it's not always easy, it's always worthwhile because as the child feels, well, obviously the first thing we all want as parents is our child to feel better. So that alone is worth it if our child is feeling better. And then when they're feeling better, they're able, you're less in crisis mode and, watching after them, and you have more time, you have less stress, you have a little more ability. And also there's a sharp learning curve at the beginning, but I will tell you it goes away and then it's no more difficult than any other diet. So get past that learning curve and I promise you it'll get easier. And there's really no downside. You improve the diet, they feel better. You all might feel better if you're all doing the diet, and it does get easier. All right, so let's talk a little bit about we'll do like maybe 10 more minutes, 15 more minutes. I'll take a few questions here. All right, so let's talk about going step by step into gluten-free and casein-free for those that that don't do this already. If you're doing a different special diet or you're considering going from GFCF to another special diet, many of the same ideas still apply. And this is the guide that you're going to get if you give me your email. I'll make sure I email it to you. All right, so first you'll see you don't actually begin the diet in my model until step 5 of 6. The beginning is getting prepared, getting educated, start experimenting, start making recipes, start feeding them to your child, see what they like, start making a meal plan, then go shopping, then, only then, might you start the special diet. That's how I like to do it. It's easier, I think, to do it that way. And then you keep a diet record, you see what gets better, you see what remains, and you go from there. So you want to make sure that GFCF diet is healthy. We don't want to just give a bunch of cookies and muffins because they're gluten-free. The gluten-free grains, rice, millet, quinoa, amaranth, even corn, some of the thickeners, the starches, the nut flours, the coconut flours, these are all gluten-free. And again, we will send you the slides. Casein-free foods. So it's easy to do milks. Milks, there's tons of options. Coconut milk, rice milk, nut milks if you can do them, homemade, store-bought. Oils are easy too. Even treats like ice creams are easy. Cheese is the hardest. So I've given you 2 cheese brands here that are gluten-free, casein-free, and soy-free. Those are Diet Cheese, and Galaxy makes one called their rice vegan cheese, because not all of their cheeses are casein-free. So you want to work on getting vegetables in wherever you can, decide whether they want them crunchy or crispy or raw or steamed or whatever it is. Try to boost those up. If you can, sneak them in because your child just has this, ooh, I don't like vegetables, but doesn't really care if they're in there, they just don't want to eat one, then this gives you a lot of ability to put them in muffins and pancakes and sauces and things like that. You can do the juicing I mentioned, you can make them crispy and crunchy we'll talk about, and you can put them in the broths. So the meal planning. So I suggest making a meal plan and, breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks. Start putting down the foods your child already eats or will eat, and start building this out before you start. You can look at different breakfasts, whether it's eggs if they're not allergic, or, I like to get some protein at breakfast. Snacks, getting healthy snacks. I like to see snacks are usually in our culture carbs. Cookies, crackers, chips. I really like to get away from that. So you'll notice most of my snacks also have some protein in them. Lunches, you can do the standard gluten-free sandwich, that kind of thing, but I like to often do a hot lunch, like leftover dinner, is a nice, easy way to go, and put it in a thermos. Dinners might be meatloafs, meat patties, a variety of different choices. And then chart your progress so you can see how things are going. All right, let's talk about some of these recipes. So all the recipes in my cookbook all the recipes here are in my cookbook. I'm going to give you a bunch of them today. They're all gluten-free, casein-free, and soy-free, and there's no added corn. So if you choose the right baking powder and stuff, they'll also be corn-free if you need that. Many grains and many recipes are either grain-free or can be made grain-free to comply with the specific carbohydrate and GAPS diets. All right. So meatballs. Meatballs are a great way. You can puree vegetables in. You can put eggs and gluten-free breadcrumbs, put them in the oven, and you're all set to go. 1 cup for 2 pounds of meat is really mild. Usually they don't notice it. If you go up to 2 cups, you notice it a little bit more. But if you use something sweet like butternut, it actually kind of brings a good flavor, and it actually makes it a little sweet, and they kind of like that. You can also make them like this. You can make them into meat patties and make them into what I would consider more of like a breakfast sausage. Another way for vegetables is to do carrot chips. I talk about carrot chips, kale chips and all sorts of crispy things. In this case, I do deep fry them. They're crispier that way, but you're gonna use your own oil. You're going to cut them really thin. That's the secret, so they're not chewy. I use a vegetable peeler instead of a knife because it can get it thinner that way. You can use any hard root vegetable like a beet or anything like that. And this helps picky eaters because they might go, ooh, I don't like vegetables. But if they see you chopping them up and then they taste like potato chips, it starts to change that perception in their mind a little bit and gives you a few vegetables, at least something for kids that don't eat any. All right, I want to talk a little bit. I don't think I'm doing my burgers with liver today, just for the sake of time, but I'll just describe them briefly. They're one of my favorites. Kids love them. You're not going to believe me, but I've never had a mom say, my kid didn't like that recipe, and what I usually hear is, those were my kids' favorite recipe. They don't know there's liver in there. And it just enhances the flavor and gives a little bit of liver without overpowering it, and it's blended up so you can't taste it. There's no texture to it. They wouldn't know. All right. Chicken pancakes are another of my favorite. For kids that like carb snacks, this is a great, it looks like a pancake, has the texture of a pancake, but there's no starch in it. So it's grain-free for those people that are doing a paleo or SED type style diet. And it makes the texture better. And it also provides, if you're trying to find, if they like, lots of carb type stuff, you can use this for a snack or for a breakfast. So you just take chicken, eggs. I'll show you a little video from my cooking course here. Let's see. Let's see. I guess it's not going to play, so we'll just have to live without it. But what you do is you take the cooked chicken and the eggs with a little salt, you blend it in a food processor, you cook them up, and they cook just like pancakes. It's really surprising, but they're delicious. I guess I did include my liver burgers here. It's actually really funny on the video. There's people in the audience with horrified looks on their faces when I start blending up the liver, but it's very easy. It's very easy. Bean burgers for people that they want to get fiber in, they want to get antioxidants in, maybe they can't do too much animal protein. The bean burgers are great. They're great. I take beans, I soak them and cook them myself because they'll be more digestible. You add nuts and seeds, blend those, or in this case I use sunflower seeds. So there's no soy in these bean burgers. My husband's a vegetarian, more or less. It's kind of a long story, but we have perfected these. We do all sorts of flavors. We make a whole bunch of them, freeze them, and then he just takes them out for lunch or whenever he needs it and heats it in a pan or something. All right, a little bit on grains. If you're new to gluten-free, with gluten, it's got that chewy texture. So you need to usually do a flour blend, and you usually want to add a little xanthan gum in. All right. You can make your own breads. They're easier, but there's some good breads out now, like Udi's bread. You can make your desserts healthier, and this is one of my favorites from my cookbook. It uses dates and coconut butter, and they're just delicious. They're sweet, but they've got good energy, and they've got good nutrition in them, and they're just a nice treat. I told you I would tell you how to make sauerkraut kid-friendly. This is probably my top one. Wait, let's go. I call it apple kraut in my cookbook. You take 50% shredded apple and 50% sauerkraut, and you blend them together, and what it does is it takes the sourness out. So for kids that don't like sour, you get kind of a sweet, sour, shredded fruit salad. You can make it totally sweet by adding more fruit, and then you can back off on sweet to get them used to that sour flavor, because we want to get their palate a bit expanded. All right. So this is my cooking course, and if you go over and you see my husband after this while I'm taking a few questions, the cooking course is all online. So it's actually a live course that I used to teach. I did videos for the whole thing. It's like 5 hours of video, cooking instructions, nutrition education, All the recipes are tagged and labeled. Everything, like I said, is gluten-free, casein-free, and soy-free. Plus, there's specific carbohydrate, low oxalate, body ecology, nut-free, egg-free, because I have so many clients with really specific allergies. And you can go straight to those recipes that your child can tolerate and get some good ideas and start making things that way. So the course is actually all online. All the videos are online. The cookbook's online. There's photos of the recipes. You can download it to your iPad or your phone, so you can have the recipes in the store, which I love. Or you can just print out the cookbook. And I did print out a couple copies of the cookbook for people that just want to buy a copy of the hard copy, because I know some people are, just prefer to have that hard copy and don't want to go to the store. Either way, I have some copies still, so if you prefer to get that too, you can. And people often ask what's different about my book from my cookbook. So I'll just briefly mention, this is my book. So it's kind of a visual table of contents for those visual learners out there. It talks about the biochemical imbalances and the physiological implications in autism. It talks about nutrients and supplements. I talk about dozens of them. Sometimes I talk about brands and forms of nutrients and suggested amounts and when, what they do. I talk about a whole bunch of different special diets, like I mentioned, when to use them, what the pitfalls are, how to do them, why people do them, and then that 12-step guide that we went through. So that's also, so this is the Nourishing Hope is all about the nutrition. It's how to kind of set a game plan, find things to ask your doctor about, tests to ask your doctor about, supplements to consider, diets to look into, and then Cooking to Heal is all about implementing it, how to do the special diet, how to feed your family this way. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here and say, if you are interested in a consultation, I do phone and Skype consultations with people all over the world, and I'm happy to set up a free 15-minute to kind of talk about your unique situation and see if we're a fit. And so my husband can talk to you and set that up. So just know that I am available if you need extra support. And this is how you can contact me. I'm at nourishinghope.com. I've got a ton of free resources. So I am going to take questions in our last 10 minutes. So like I said, if you have to end early and you want to either sign up for my email or you're interested in the book or anything like that, just go over to my booth and my husband Martin can help you. But for those of you, I'd love to answer some questions. Yeah? Bread machines. Usually you can use... She's wondering if I have any recipes for bread machines. You can usually use a lot of the homemade recipes in your bread machine. In my cookbook, I talk about one of my favorite mixes, which is Breads from Anna. And Breads from Anna works great in a bread machine. So a lot of times you can use some of those, either yeast-based ones or otherwise, and use them in your bread machine. So I would say... probably my favorite is for a mix is theirs, because they have a yeast-free version. They have it's gluten-free, casein-free, soy-free, egg-free, that kind of thing. So I would just use any good gluten-free recipe you can use. I like to use something that has a little bit of like a combination of like rice, maybe potato starch and tapioca, or some sorghum or something like that, like a Carol Fenster recipe or Betty Hegman. Who else? Yeah. So when you have lots of allergies, you're saying, where can you go? Are you thinking of like carb-based, gluten-free type stuff, or are you thinking of meats and things like that? Got it. Got it. Yeah, I guess there's multiple facets to that question. How do you, when you have a lot of allergies, how do you, are there any good resources? So a couple things. Firstly, before I forget, sometimes going straight to the farmer can get you great quality eggs and great quality meat at a cheap price. So I don't know of a good website per se for like flours. I mean, where I live, there's a great place called Azure Standard, and but that's only kind of on the West Coast. I don't know if they go down this way or not. Yeah? Oh, okay. So Azure has lots of great, like you can buy big things in bulk and they're really well priced. If you make it yourself, it's a lot cheaper than if you buy it. So buying the ingredients and making it's good. And then if you're looking for good websites, there's a lot of good like mom blogs and stuff that have really well-tested gluten-free recipes that might be a good way rather than experimenting and throwing half of it out. And start with a small amount until you get kind of perfect some recipes. Then you can buy the big ones, the big stuff. All right, what other questions? Yeah. Yeah. So how do you know for a probiotic what a good dosage or a good amount is? Well, often, again, it depends on the individual and it can range a lot. And that's where sometimes the doctors might even do a lot higher. But typically, a good one is going to be something with multiple strains, lactobacillus strains and bifido strains. They're going to usually start at like 25 billion. Some people even do like a VSL3 that's got hundreds of billion, but that's also available by prescription. You can get it from your doctor. So, I usually think of starting at maybe 25 billion. And, or actually, let me just say, so I can't give, suggestions of what you should do, but I could give you some ideas to think about and do some more looking into. So I always, whenever you look at something on the label and they say take one and it's got 25 billion, I always start with a tiny sprinkle. There's always a tiny bit, see how it's tolerated and, get up to the amount. And then some people do more than that. And it really just sort of really varies so much based on the person. But most biomedical practitioners, I hear about, usually it's like 25, maybe 50 billion, something. It sounds like a lot, but even probiotic-rich fermented foods have that much very often, or if not more. Yeah?
What do you think of Dr. D'Adammo's work with the blood type?
Yeah. So what do I think of the blood type diet? I think it's interesting. I think that for some people, like I would say that it applies perfectly to me and perfectly to my husband. And he's an A, he's a vegetarian. I'm an O, I'm not. I was a vegetarian until it did not work for me. I think he's really onto something. I don't like, what I don't do is say, oh, you're this blood type, this is your diet. But I might use it to refine certain things, like when I looked at that list and found out that cashews don't work well, I was like, no wonder I can't stand cashews, So it kind of helped refine things for me. And there is definitely something to lectins and lectin-rich foods that are inflammatory. So I think having your diet that meets, those blood type needs, I think there's something to it. I haven't seen research necessarily, more some anecdotal evidence. Oh, great. All right. What other? We got 5 more minutes, and I think maybe some of you have questions. Yeah. Can you change what over?
Probiotics that I'm buying currently to a kefir.
Got it. So can you change from your supplement of probiotics to a fermented food like a kefir? Yes. It depends on the person, though. So fermented foods are mostly lactobacillus strains, and lactobacillus is great because it creates an acidic medium and crowds out the bad guys and helps populate many more of the species of the good guys. But, there are also the bifido strains that could be low. So if you have a stool test and you know that you're low in the bifido strains, then you might benefit with a supplement. For people that are generally healthy, then they might just do just fermented foods because they kind of just keep everything going in the right direction. So I tend to like going with food first. So I tend to like the fermented foods, but you might also supplement with the probiotics depending on who you are. That's how I would think of it. Was there someone in the back down there? Yeah. Yep. You mean when you're soaking them or what? Yeah. So what do I think about apple cider vinegar for things like beans and things like that? What I understand is that grains work best to soak them in something acidic and fermented like apple cider vinegar. Beans work best with water. I don't know if there's something about the acid that they don't need, but usually with the beans, I usually just do water. You can cook them soak them in water, rinse them, drain them, cook them. You can even cook them with kombu, and kombu can help make them more digestible. So I usually do it that way. Yeah. Got it. Okay. So water, I typically recommend a water filter. And there is a water filter company that I bought mine at, because what I like about them is a lot of times with water filters, it took me years to ever buy a water filter, because I trying to weed through the marketing hype, I just couldn't figure it out, and it was overwhelming. So what I ended up doing was going to a company called ConsciousLivingSystems.com, and it's Conscious Living Water Systems that's the website. What I like is that the man is unbelievably knowledgeable, and he makes like 6 or 7 different types of water filters based on where you live and what kind of water you have. Do you have well water, city water, agricultural runoff? Do you need to worry about nitrates or fluoride or chlorine or chloramines? And he will help to tailor the water filter for you. And I don't find them outrageously expensive. They even have whole house filters that I only wish I could buy, but I live in a building where I can't really filter the water for the whole building, but I wish if I lived in a house, I would absolutely have one of those. And if you tell them Healthful Living, then they'll give you a 10% discount. And your food, your pan. I tend to like cast iron, enameled cast iron, and stainless steel that attracts a magnet, so it's lower in nickel. I don't know that much about the ceramic ones and the titanium ones, or some of those. I tend to be a traditionalist, typically, and those are the ones that we've used for the longest, that we know the most about. Someone in the middle here had a question. Did you have a question?
Probiotics. They say that when you have a course of antibiotics, you should repopulate with a probiotic. And I'm wondering, I know that homeostatic nutrients, which the guy that does the Maker's Diet, Ruben, whatever.
You mean soil-based organisms? Is that, yeah? Mm-hmm.
Organisms. Do we have to use probiotics today if we're eating this kind of diet? And after we've done a course of them, will they stay populated? Or?
I think if you have a healthy gut and you have your good bacteria populated up, and you just eat fermented foods in your daily diet, I personally think that's sufficient. Because over the millennia, we ate fermented foods every day. Our milk would turn to yogurt, we have to make sauerkraut, so we had vitamin C in the wintertime, and we ate fermented foods, or at least a carrot from the ground, and we got that good bacteria every day. So I know that for thousands of years that was sufficient. So if we're healthy, I do believe that would be sufficient. It's just that so many of us aren't quite there yet. Yeah, and then I think you need more help often, but they are my favorite. Yeah.
He's 13 years old, as big as I am. He's still eating a case a day, over a case a day. Besides the enormous cost, where do I find professional help?
Where do you find what?
Professional help. I need professional help.
Yes. Where do you find professional help? What I've heard, well, you could do one of 3 things. You could look online for a feeding therapist. And someone in here actually, or someone came into my booth and said Kate Toomey, which actually is one of, I think, the best types of feeding therapists. I have a friend who's a feeding therapist who says wonderful things about her approach. So you might be able to find her or someone like her. What else? OTs can often help assess certain bits and sometimes can help with desensitization. Speech therapists can often help you figure out, can they not find the rice in their mouth because they can't move their tongue side to side? And is that why they prefer soft, pureed things or whatever? So occupational therapists and speech therapists, especially speech, often have a secondary certification in feeding or might be able to assess and direct you to somebody. I don't know. I know that there are a variety of them. I know CARD has a feeding, a intensive feeding program, and there are other people like that have some intensives. It also depends on what your approach is and what approach you think your child might need. So you might do a little research to kind of figure out, and maybe talk to some people might be a good start. All right, let me see. We are 1 minute over. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my booth. I'm going to stand there for people who have questions, whatever it might be, and I'll answer more questions for you there. I'm happy to stay and answer questions. Thank you.